How to stop procrastinating and finally take action. The role of fear in procrastination. If you struggle with procrastination, find it hard to tackle difficult tasks, or sometimes lack discipline, then this video is for you. In the world of self-help and personal development, there's one major factor that doesn't get enough attention: the powerful impact of negative emotions that keep us from taking action. It's not that you're lazy, unmotivated, or undisciplined. The real issue is a hidden force holding you back. And that force is fear. In this video, we'll explore 6 small but effective experiments designed to help you reduce fear's impact, break free from procrastination, and finally get started on whatever you've been putting off. Understanding our fears is the first step to overcoming them. More often than not, procrastination isn't just about motivation or discipline, it's driven by fear and anxiety. This happens because of something called an amygdala hijack. Our brain's built-in threat detection system, the amygdala, kicks into overdrive whenever we perceive something as scary or uncertain, even if there's no actual danger. Instead of protecting us from real threats like wild animals, it treats things like starting a project, posting online, or making a big life change as if they were life or death risks. To keep us safe, our brain pushes us toward the easiest, least risky option: doing nothing. But here's the good news: once we recognize this pattern, we can work with it. So let's dive into 6 practical experiments to help you beat procrastination and finally take action on the things that matter. 6 micro experiments to combat fear. Experiment 1: the emotion label. There's a fascinating study that illustrates this idea, which I discuss in my book. A group of researchers at UCLA gathered people who were afraid of spiders and asked them to get close to a Chilean rose-haired tarantula. The participants were divided into different groups. Some were told to distract themselves, others were asked to reframe their fear, but one group was simply instructed to name their fear out loud. For example, they might say, "I feel anxious that the spider is going to jump on me." The results were striking. The group that verbalized their fear felt noticeably less afraid and were more willing to approach the spider. Just by putting their emotions into words, they were able to process their fear rather than be controlled by it. In psychology, this technique is known as effective labeling, and it applies to procrastination as well. Most of the time, we don't explicitly acknowledge the real fears holding us back. Instead of saying, "I'm afraid of failure," or "I'm afraid of what people will think of me," we tend to say things like, "I'm too busy right now," "I don't have the right idea," or "I just don't have time." But when we recognize and name the real fear behind our hesitation, that's when it starts to lose its grip on us. So that's experiment number 1, the emotion label. Now, let's dive into the audiobook to break this down further. Labeling our emotions forces us to identify and understand what we're experiencing. It works in 2 key ways. First, it increases self-awareness. By naming and acknowledging our fears, we develop a deeper understanding of our emotional patterns. Second, it helps reduce rumination. When we dwell on our fears without confronting them, we convince ourselves that they're justified. But by labeling our emotions, we gain the ability to process and release them, breaking the cycle of overthinking and procrastination. The challenge is that labeling our emotions isn't always easy. We're really good at coming up with logical reasons for avoiding things. We might tell ourselves, "I'm not putting off starting my business because I'm scared, I just haven't found the right idea yet." So how do we make a habit of naming our fears and learning to process them? One helpful method is to ask yourself a few key questions whenever you're procrastinating. Start with, "What am I afraid of?" Our biggest insecurities and vulnerabilities are often at the root of procrastination. Then, take it a step further and ask, where does this fear come from? Is it a me reason or a them reason? Me reasons are fears tied to your self-perception, things like worrying you're not good enough or not prepared enough. Them reasons are fears about how others will react, like being afraid people won't like your work or that they'll judge you. Clarifying whether your fear comes from within or from external concerns can help you understand what's really holding you back. And if you're still struggling to pinpoint your fear, here's a trick I find helpful: imagine someone in your exact situation. If you had to tell a story about what they might be feeling, what emotions or fears would come up? Often, by depersonalizing the situation, it becomes easier to see the fear for what it is. You might realize, oh, in that scenario, this person would probably be afraid of what others think of them, and that's probably what I'm afraid of too. So, that's the power of the emotion label. Experiment 2, the identity label. Sometimes, our fears are tied to something very specific, like starting a project or facing a tarantula. But more often, our fears are broader. They're not just about individual challenges, they're about the way we see ourselves. We often assign ourselves labels like "I'm not a runner," "I'm terrible at math," or "I'm just not a creative person." These identity-based fears can hold us back just as much as more specific ones. Back in the 1960s, psychologist Howard Becker introduced the concept of labeling theory, suggesting that the labels society places on us can profoundly shape our behavior. His research found that individuals who were labeled as criminals after a first offense were much more likely to commit crimes again. In other words, labels can become self-fulfilling prophecies. The same thing happens in everyday life. You go through one bad relationship and suddenly believe you're just bad at relationships. You fail one test and decide you're an academic failure. These labels don't just describe us, they shape our future actions. That's why experiment number 2 is the identity label. But here's the good news: labeling works both ways. Just as negative labels can reinforce fear and avoidance, positive labels can help us move past them. For example, when I experience self-doubt, one of my favorite labels to use is lifelong learner. This reminds me that my identity is about growth and adaptability. A lifelong learner doesn't get stuck in procrastination for long, they find a way to figure things out. So, when you catch yourself procrastinating, take a look at the labels you use. Are you over-identifying with the problem? What's a more empowering way to define yourself? Could you see yourself as someone who works hard, has overcome challenges before, or meets their deadlines? The way you label yourself can directly influence your behavior. This might sound like a small, semantic shift, but it's actually a powerful psychological tool. Labels aren't just passive tags placed on us by others, they shape our self-perception. And one of the strongest forces in human nature is the desire to stay consistent with how we define ourselves. So, if we can change the label, we can change the fear. And when we change the fear, we stop procrastinating and start taking action on what really matters. Experiment number 3, the October 10th, 10 Rule. The October 10th, 10 Rule, putting fear in perspective. One of the reasons fear can feel so paralyzing is that we tend to catastrophize, blowing setbacks out of proportion in our minds. A small failure suddenly feels like the end of the world. For example, imagine you get rejected by someone you like. Instead of seeing it as just one disappointing moment, you convince yourself that you're unlovable and destined to spend your life alone. This kind of thinking keeps us stuck, making fears seem bigger than they really are. When you catch yourself spiraling like this, try taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture. In psychology, this process is called cognitive reappraisal, changing the way we interpret a situation to manage our emotions more effectively. A simple way to do this is by using what I call the October 10th, 10 rule. Ask yourself 3 questions. Will this matter in 10 minutes? Will this matter in 10 weeks? Will this matter in 10 years? Let's go back to the rejection example. Will this matter in 10 minutes? Probably, it might sting, and you might want to avoid that person for a little while. Will this matter in 10 weeks? Maybe, but chances are you'll be much less upset. Life moves on. Will this matter in 10 years? Almost certainly not. You'll meet plenty of new people between now and then, and this moment will just be a small blip in the grand scheme of things. The October 10th, 10 rule helps put our fears into perspective. It reminds us that most failures and setbacks aren't permanent and that what feels overwhelming now usually won't define us in the long run. While the rejection example might sound like a typical high school or college problem, this kind of fear shows up at every stage of life. Whether you're in your 20s, 30s, 40s, or beyond, it's easy to catastrophize decisions, worrying that taking a risk will ruin everything. What if I fail? What if I lose everything? What if I end up alone and broke? A great tool for countering this kind of thinking is fear setting, an exercise popularized by Tim Ferriss. If you're curious, just Google Tim Ferriss fear setting. It's a journaling process designed to help you break down your fears and see them more rationally. I've found this exercise incredibly useful whenever I'm facing a big decision or putting something off because it feels too scary. More often than not, it helps me realize that the fear in my head is much bigger than the actual risk in reality. Experiment number 4, the confidence equation. Self-doubt is one of the biggest fears standing between us and our goals. It's that nagging voice that tells us we're just not good enough to do the thing we want to do. I often think of self-doubt as a kind of suspended animation. One part of us is excited about an opportunity, thinking, I really want to do this. But another part immediately shuts it down with, there's no way I can. The result? Paralysis. For example, I procrastinate on writing all the time. On one hand, I have a deep desire to write my book, to create something meaningful and helpful. But on the other, there's that little voice whispering, anything I write is going to be garbage anyway, so why bother? At its core, self-confidence equals perception of ability, perception of standards. If we believe our ability is higher than the standard required, we feel confident. If we believe our ability is lower than the standard, we doubt ourselves. So how do we work through this? A simple but powerful question to ask is, can I just get started, even though I feel unconfident? In almost every case, the answer is yes. I don't need to be a professional bodybuilder to work out for an hour. I don't need my first business plan to be a work of genius. And I definitely don't need my first draft to be a masterpiece. The idea that we should only start when we feel confident is one of the biggest mental blocks we face. The solution? Just start. You won't need to be perfect for a long time, so stop waiting until you feel ready. This struggle is especially common among high achievers. If you've made it this far, you're probably a smart and successful person in some area of life. The challenge comes when you try to do something new. You're used to operating at a high level, so your standards are up here. But your ability, because you're a beginner, is down here. And that gap between where you are and where you want to be creates self-doubt. The problem is, high achievers want to be good from day one. We don't want to struggle or suck at something. But that's just not how learning works. A strategy I've found incredibly helpful for this comes from Oliver Burkeman's book 4,000 Weeks, which I highly recommend. His advice? Lower the bar. Just embrace mediocrity. Accept that you're going to suck at something in the beginning, and that's okay. The first 100 reps are going to be rough. That's normal. And if you're worried about what other people will think of that, well, that takes us to experiment number 5, stop spotlighting. Experiment 5, stop spotlighting. We're highly attuned to what others think of us. As social creatures, our amygdala is constantly scanning for threats to our status. This creates the illusion that we're always under a spotlight, that everyone around us is watching, analyzing our actions, and passing judgment on our worth. But research suggests otherwise. In a series of studies from the early 2000s, psychology professor Thomas Gilovich and his co-authors demonstrated that people consistently overestimate how much others notice or judge them. We stress over the smallest details of our appearance and behavior, assuming they'll be scrutinized. In reality, most people are too busy worrying about themselves to pay much attention to us. This means that the so-called spotlight effect can be reduced with a simple reminder: no one cares. And when fear is holding you back from doing something, this realization can be incredibly freeing. No one cares if my first few YouTube videos are awkward and cringeworthy. No one cares if my blog posts are a bit rough because I'm still learning to write. No one cares if I show up to a salsa class as a total beginner without a partner. No one cares if my belt doesn't match my shoes at this party. Adopting this no one cares mindset can be life-changing. It's one of the simplest, most effective ways I've found to reduce anxiety-driven procrastination. I like to think of it as a muscle. The more you put yourself out there and realize that no one actually cares, the stronger this muscle becomes. Over time, you stop worrying so much about what people think. And now, let's move on to experiment number 6, the Batman effect. Experiment 6, the Batman effect. The Batman effect was first identified by a team of researchers led by Professor Rachel White at the University of Pennsylvania. They wanted to see if adopting an alter ego could improve a child's ability to focus and persist through a challenging task. In their study, children were given an activity that required concentration while being tempted by a more enjoyable distraction nearby. The children were divided into 3 groups. One received no special instructions, the second was asked to reflect on their own thoughts and feelings, and the third was encouraged to imagine themselves as a superhero or another character they admired. The results were striking. The children who imagined themselves as superheroes displayed significantly better self-control, focus, and perseverance than those in the other 2 groups. This suggests that when we step into the traits of a fearless, confident alter ego, we gain access to a level of courage and determination that we might not otherwise feel. I've found this especially useful when it comes to public speaking. Even though I've been giving presentations and teaching for years, I still experience moments of self-doubt and insecurity. In these situations, I tap into my own alter ego, young Charles Xavier, aka Professor X from X-Men. My physical trigger for stepping into this identity is putting on my fake glasses. Even though I've had laser eye surgery and no longer need them, I still wear glasses in public settings. They help me embody a professional, intellectual persona, allowing me to overcome imposter syndrome and step into a more confident version of myself. Conclusion: embracing fear and taking action. In the end, the goal isn't to eliminate fear, it's to build the courage to face it. That courage comes from 3 key sources. First, understand your fear. Ask yourself, why haven't I started that task or project yet? What exactly am I afraid of? Where does this fear come from? Gaining clarity on your fears is the first step toward overcoming them. Second, put fear into perspective. Our fears are often exaggerated, making things seem worse than they really are. To stop yourself from catastrophizing, ask, will this still matter in 10 minutes? In 10 weeks? In 10 years? These questions can help you see things more rationally. Finally, overcome your fear. If you're worried about what other people think, remember that most people aren't actually thinking about you. We tend to be self-conscious, but we're not nearly as judgmental as we assume. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.